In Fire Emblem Fates Conquest, the story is frequently maligned for explicitly stating in some chapters that no enemy soldiers were killed, in direct contrast to what happens in gameplay. Frequently, the game will provide various story justifications to avoid having Corrin kill anyone, so I'll be looking into each individual chapter to see how true that is. I'll be looking at each of the individual justifications to see how often they show up. I'll be tracking if Corrin kills nobody, has an indeterminate number of kills, or is directly involved in the death of a named character. In the prologue, there are 0 kills because this is essentially a dream sequence, and of course no one can die in a dream. In Chapter 1, Corrin spars against Xander, and no one dies because it is just a spar. In Chapter 2, one of the earliest and more egregious examples, Garen commands that Corrin kill some prisoners. A bunch of unnamed prisoners die at Garen's hand, but the named characters Rinka and Kaze, their deaths are faked, and so Corrin kills 0 people in this chapter. In Chapter 3, some other characters like Hans and Camilla have kills in cutscenes, but the number that Corrin is responsible for is not explicitly or implicitly stated. In Chapter 4, all of the enemies are faceless, so they don't really count. In Chapter 5, you mostly fight Valite soldiers who are more like ghosts, so they don't really count. The explosion of the Ganglari is confirmed to have killed a lot of civilians, though different characters will either absolve or blame Corrin for these deaths. The story does seem to want to tell you that it's not really Corrin's fault, so I'll say 0. In Chapter 6, you only drive back the Hoshiden Royals, so there are 0 kills there. In Chapter 7, Corrin only fights faceless, which don't count. Chapter 8 is one of the more obvious examples where Corrin fights the Ice Tribe, but doesn't kill any of them explicitly according to the story, so that is 0. But the number of enemy soldiers that are killed or captured is not explicitly or implicitly stated, so the number here is indeterminate. In Chapter 10, Corrin defends the port from Takumi and his forces and drives them back. It is not explicitly stated that there are 0 deaths, but it is implied that the number of Hoshiden soldiers that are dead is low. In Chapter 11, it is explicitly stated that none of the Hoshiden soldiers have been killed, and the Rainbow Sage commits suicide, meaning that Corrin's kill count here is exactly 0. In Chapter 12, Ryoma and his forces apparently retreat, and the deaths are also brushed over, so it is implied that the number of deaths here is 0. In Chapter 13, for the Cheval Rebellion, it is not explicitly stated that there are 0 kills, but the number is implied to be low, even though all of the rest are killed by Hans after they have surrendered. In Chapter 14, you fight a bunch of Hoshiden assassins, and while their deaths are not explicitly stated, it is implied that they are killed. For Chapter 15, you fight exclusively against Valite soldiers, so they don't count. In Chapter 16, you have the choice, the only one in the game, to either kill or spare Shura, so that's at least 1. All the other pirates, their fate is indeterminate. For Chapter 17, Kotaro definitely dies, but it's not necessarily Corrin that does it. An unspecified number of Mokushu ninjas probably die, but all of the Hoshido ninjas are explicitly spared. For Chapter 18, you fight a bunch of Norian assassins and Zola. The assassins are all probably dead, but Zola is killed by Leo. In Chapter 19, in a strange turn of events, all of the Kitsune that attack you are killed. Strangely, whatever method Corrin was using before to do non-lethal combat apparently doesn't work here for various reasons. In Chapter 20, you fight against Fuga in the Wind Tribe, but this is a spar or a test, so no one is killed. In Chapter 21, you only fight against Faceless, so they don't count. In Chapter 22, some indeterminate number of soldiers are probably killed, but Garen, Hans, and Yako kill a bunch of them. You don't have to fight Hana or Tsubaki, so their fates are also indeterminate. But Sakura and Yukimura are definitely left alive. In Chapter 23, some indeterminate number of Hoshiden soldiers also die, but the rest are spared, and Corrin doesn't kill Takumi because he jumps off of a bridge and probably dies there. For Chapter 24, some indeterminate number of Hoshiden soldiers die. Hinoka, her retainers, and the remainder are however spared. In Chapter 25, the only confirmed death is Ryoma, and that's because he commits suicide. You don't have to fight the rest of the enemies. For Chapter 26, Hans, Iago, and the rest of the loyalists all definitely die, even though Iago was killed by Leo. In Chapter 27, Garen definitely dies, and all of the other soldiers are Valite soldiers, who don't really count. In the endgame, the enemies are just Valite soldiers and also Takumi, who is technically already dead and you're just kind of destroying his possessed corpse. But we can count that. So now that we looked at every chapter, let's have some conclusions. Corrin is only explicitly involved in killing characters in maybe 3 to 4 chapters. Most of the time, it is left vague. There's Chapter 16, where Corrin can kill Shura. In Chapter 19, where Corrin definitely is involved in the death of all the Kitsune. and chapter 27 and the endgame for Garen and Takumi. The explicit in-story mentions of Corrin not killing anyone only really happens 3 times. In chapter 8, the Frost Tribe, in chapter 11, Hinoka's forces, and in chapter 17, all of the Hoshida ninjas. We have 2 situations where characters will commit suicide to avoid being killed by Corrin, namely the Rainbow Sage and Ryoma, in chapters 11 and 25. There are 3 chapters where Corrin exclusively fights faceless, who don't really count because they're basically zombies. And there are 4 chapters where Corrin mostly fights Valite soldiers who don't count because they're basically ghosts. There's 3 chapters where Leo specifically bails Corrin out by killing characters that Corrin was deciding whether or not to kill. And in around 3 chapters, Garen, Hans, and Iago will kill characters that Corrin was originally intending to spare anyway. So, does Corrin kill anybody in Conquest? Oh yes, just probably mostly unnamed characters though. This actually isn't too much different from other Fire Emblem games, where they don't really talk explicitly about your lord character killing another character. At the same time, the story does kind of bend over backwards, providing various loopholes, excuses, and justifications for why the main character doesn't directly kill anyone, often not even by Corrin's own volition. Most of the cases where Corrin doesn't kill are also heavily front-loaded, but at the same time, there's no real midpoint in the story where there's an attitude shift in any way. Even towards the end, it is mostly just kind of left indeterminate. So we have this weird situation where at the start, the story really cares that Corrin goes full non-lethal, but as the story progresses, it really doesn't. None of the Hoshidan siblings ever really call Corrin out on killing Hoshidans. They just kind of leave it like, oh, we've got a lot of people wounded. It's probably left intentionally vague so Corrin can somehow become like even more righteous in the story despite killing more people, which is a bit strange. The only explicit thing that Corrin is ever really blamed for is the incident in chapter 5 where the Ganglari blows up and kills a bunch of civilians. The story obviously wants you to know that that's not Corrin's fault. Even Takumi, who hates Corrin for supernatural reasons, doesn't even bring up all of the Hoshidans killed in the war, leading to the absurd implication that Corrin wages war on Hoshido and is not responsible for any of the deaths in that war, which makes no sense. Alright, so in conclusion, I have no idea what the fuck is going on in this story. Either Corrin kills a lot of people in a way that's simply not even acknowledged by his active detractors as reasons for why he's a bad person, or he doesn't kill anyone at all in a manner that is simply absurd. So I think the best way to put it is that on this matter, the story is just mainly incoherent and inconsistent, and trying to look for deeper meaning is pointless. So thanks for watching, everyone. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and see you in the next one, I guess.